The war was over. At least that's what the calendar said. But for the men who fought it, the war never truly ends. It lives in their dreams, in their scars, in the hollow spaces where friends used to stand. And sometimes, the war reveals truths so profound, so impossible to believe, that they shatter everything we thought we knew about humanity. April 1945. The smell of death hung over Europe like a funeral shroud. Smoke still rose from the ruins of 1,000 cities. The bodies of soldiers and civilians alike lay scattered across fields that had once grown wheat and corn. Now they grew only graves. The Third Reich was collapsing, crumbling like a castle made of sand. Its armies, once so mighty and terrifying, were now broken, scattered, defeated. And among those defeated soldiers were members of the Waffen-SS, the elite fighting force that had carried out some of the war's most brutal atrocities. These SS officers had seen everything. They had witnessed the horrors of the Eastern Front, where entire villages were burned and millions died in the snow. They had participated in campaigns of terror designed to break the will of entire nations. They knew what happened to prisoners. They knew because they had been the ones deciding that fate for years. And now, as prisoners themselves, they expected no mercy. They expected to die. But something happened in those final days of the war that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Something that made no sense. Something that challenged every belief they held about their enemies, about the world, about what it meant to be human. Canadian soldiers shared their last rations with their starving German prisoners. And the SS officers couldn't believe it. Let me take you back to understand why this moment was so impossible, so revolutionary, so utterly incomprehensible to the men who experienced it. The Canadian soldiers who found themselves guarding German prisoners in April 1945 were not fresh recruits. These were battle-hardened veterans who had fought their way across Europe, from the beaches of Normandy through the hell of the Falaise Gap, through the flooded fields of the Netherlands, through forests and towns where their friends had died by the thousands. They had seen what the Germans were capable of. Many of them had liberated concentration camps and witnessed atrocities that no human being should ever see. They had every reason to hate. Every reason to take revenge. Every reason to let these prisoners starve. And they were starving. By April 1945, Germany was a nation eating itself alive. The supply lines had collapsed. Cities were rubble. Farms had been destroyed or abandoned. The German army itself was running out of food, and prisoners were the last priority. Some of these SS officers hadn't eaten a proper meal in weeks. They were skeletal, hollow-eyed, stumbling shadows of the proud soldiers they had once been. Their uniforms hung off their bodies like fabric draped over coat hangers. Their skin was gray, their movements slow and deliberate, conserving every precious calorie. They knew what starvation felt like. Many of them had watched their comrades die from it on the Eastern Front during the brutal Russian winters. Now they expected the same fate. They had been taught that the Allies, especially the Soviets, would show no mercy to SS prisoners. They had been told stories of captured SS men being tortured, executed, left to die. And honestly, after what the SS had done, they couldn't blame their captors if those stories were true. They had made their choices. They had followed their orders. Now came the reckoning. The first few days of captivity passed in a blur of exhaustion and fear. The German prisoners were herded into makeshift camps, often just fields surrounded by barbed wire. There were no buildings, no shelter, just the open sky and the cold ground. They huddled together for warmth, waiting. Some of them prayed. Some of them cursed. Some of them just stared into the distance, seeing nothing, feeling nothing, waiting for death. But death didn't come. Instead, Canadian soldiers appeared with food. At first, the prisoners didn't understand. They thought perhaps this was some kind of cruel trick, that the food would be taken away or that it was poisoned. The SS officers especially were suspicious. They had been trained to see deception everywhere, to trust no one, especially not the enemy. One officer, whose name has been lost to history but whose story was recorded by a war correspondent, later described the moment like this: "We saw them coming with cans and boxes. We thought they were bringing tools to dig graves. When they started handing out food, we thought we were hallucinating. It made no sense. Why would they feed us? What could they possibly gain from keeping us alive? The food wasn't much." The Canadian soldiers themselves were on reduced rations. Supply lines were stretched thin, and feeding an army in the field is a massive logistical challenge even in the best circumstances. These were not the best circumstances. But the Canadians took what they had and divided it. They gave portions to the prisoners. Not scraps. Not leftovers. Equal shares. Sometimes the Canadians themselves went without so the prisoners could eat. This was the moment that broke the SS officers. Not the defeat. Not the surrender. Not the collapse of everything they had fought for. this act of inexplicable mercy. One German lieutenant, captured near the border between Germany and the Netherlands, later wrote in his diary about the experience. His words were found decades after the war, yellowed pages filled with cramped handwriting. He wrote, "I cannot explain what happened to me when the Canadian soldier handed me a tin of corned beef and a piece of bread. I looked at his face, expecting to see hatred, contempt, disgust. I saw only tiredness. He looked as exhausted as we did. He nodded at me and moved on to the next prisoner. I held that tin in my hands and I wept. For the first time since I was a boy, I wept. Why did the Canadians do it? That's the question that haunted the German prisoners. That's the question that still resonates today. These weren't naive young men who didn't know what the SS had done. They knew. Many of them had lost friends and brothers to German bullets and bombs. They had every justification for letting these prisoners suffer. No one would have blamed them. No international law would have been violated. The prisoners were being held in the field during active combat operations. Claiming there wasn't enough food would have been entirely plausible. But the Canadians made a different choice. And that choice said something profound about who they were and what they believed. To understand this moment fully, we need to understand the contrast. We need to understand what happened to Allied prisoners in German hands. Because that contrast makes what the Canadians did even more remarkable. Allied prisoners of war, especially those held by the Germans, faced brutal conditions. While it's true that German POW camps holding Western Allied prisoners were generally better than Japanese camps or Soviet camps, they were still places of suffering and deprivation. Canadian airmen shot down over Germany found themselves in camps like Stalag Luft III, where they lived on watery soup made from grass or cabbage leaves, black bread that was more sawdust than flour, and occasional bits of spoiled meat. They survived on about 800 to 1,000 calories a day while being forced to perform hard labor. Men lost 30, 40, 50 pounds. Their teeth fell out from scurvy. Their bodies broke down from malnutrition. They lived in constant fear of the guards, who were sometimes brutal, sometimes indifferent, rarely kind. The food parcels from the Red Cross were lifelines. Canadian prisoners said those parcels were the best, packed with Klim milk powder, butter, cheese, corned beef, salmon, chocolate, and tea. Each parcel was supposed to provide about 2,000 calories a day for a week. But the parcels didn't always arrive. They were delayed, stolen, sold on the black market by guards. Prisoners sometimes went months without receiving any supplemental food. They shared what they had, stretching every morsel as far as it would go. Some men formed groups to pool their resources. Others traded cigarettes and chocolate for extra food. The entire economy of the prison camps revolved around hunger. And that was in the camps holding Western prisoners, where at least some international conventions were followed. For prisoners in Japanese hands, conditions were exponentially worse. Canadian soldiers captured in Hong Kong faced starvation diets, savage beatings, disease, and random executions. They were worked literally to death, building railways and airfields. The Japanese guards showed no mercy, no compassion, no recognition of the prisoners as fellow human beings. The SS officers who became prisoners of the Canadians in 1945 knew this. They knew how prisoners were treated because they themselves had been the guards and the enforcers. The SS had run concentration camps. They had overseen the deaths of millions. They had participated in mass executions on the Eastern Front. They had burned villages and shot civilians. When they looked at the Canadian soldiers now guarding them, they expected revenge. They expected to be treated the way they had treated others. Instead, they got corned beef and bread. One SS Hauptsturmführer, a captain, later testified during the Nuremberg trials. He wasn't on trial himself, but he was called as a witness in another case. During his testimony, he was asked about his experiences as a prisoner of war. He hesitated for a long time before answering. Finally, he said, "The Canadians treated us better than we treated our own men. I saw Canadian soldiers go without food so we could eat. I saw them give us their blankets when it rained. I saw them treat our wounded. And I kept asking myself, why? Why would they do this for us? We were their enemies. We had killed their friends. We represented everything they had fought against. And yet they treated us like human beings. It was the greatest defeat I ever experienced. Not the military defeat. The moral defeat. Because it forced me to confront what we had become." That testimony was buried in thousands of pages of trial documents. It's not famous. It didn't change history. But it's there, a small testament to a moment when humanity triumphed over hatred. The Canadians didn't do this because of orders. There were no official policies requiring soldiers to share their personal rations with prisoners. They did it because of who they were. Many of them were farm boys from Ontario and Alberta, Saskatchewan and Manitoba. They had been raised with certain values. You help people who are suffering. You feed the hungry. You show mercy to the defeated. These weren't abstract principles. They were the basic rules of how you lived your life. But there was also something deeper. Something about seeing the enemy up close, not as monsters but as men. Young men mostly. Boys really. 18, 19, 20 years old. Drafted into a war they didn't start, fighting for a cause many of them had stopped believing in, now broken and defeated and terrified. When you look into the eyes of a starving 19-year-old boy, it doesn't matter what uniform he's wearing. You see the hunger. You see the fear. You see the humanity. A Canadian sergeant from Manitoba later told a reporter years after the war about guarding German prisoners. He said, "I hated them. I absolutely hated them. We'd just come from liberating a concentration camp. We'd seen things I can't even describe. Things that still wake me up at night. And now we were supposed to guard these SS bastards. Part of me wanted to shoot every one of them. Part of me wanted to let them starve. But then I saw this kid couldn't have been more than 17 and he was crying. Just sitting there in the mud, crying. And I thought about my little brother back home. He was about that age. And I thought, what if my brother had been born in Germany? What if he'd been drafted into the SS? Would I want someone to let him starve? So I gave the kid my chocolate bar. He looked at me like I'd given him $1 million. And then I gave him my cigarettes too because I figured if he could trade them for more food, he should have them." That sergeant's name was William Morrison. He died in 1987. He never considered himself a hero. He said he just did what felt right at the time. But to the German prisoners, men like William Morrison were incomprehensible. Their entire worldview was built on strength and dominance. You conquered or you were conquered. You dominated or you were dominated. Mercy was weakness. Compassion was a vulnerability to be exploited. They had been taught that their enemies were subhuman, that Canadians and British and Americans were soft, decadent, weak. They had been told that when the tide turned, the Allies would take terrible revenge. Instead they got compassion. And it destroyed them in a way that no bullet ever could. After the war, when the prison camps were established more permanently, the German POWs in Canada experienced something even more shocking. They were put to work on farms and in forests. They were paid small wages. They were allowed to play sports, organize educational courses, even publish their own newspapers. They lived in heated barracks. They received proper food. They were treated, as many of them later said, better than German soldiers were treated by their own army. Some of them didn't want to leave when the war ended. They applied to immigrate to Canada. They wanted to stay in the country that had captured them because they had been treated with dignity and respect. Think about that. Enemy soldiers, members of the SS, some of them wanting to stay in Canada because they had been shown more humanity there than in their own homeland. This isn't a story about forgiving the unforgivable. The SS committed atrocities that can never be forgiven, never be forgotten. The men who gave those orders, who pulled those triggers, who operated those gas chambers, deserved every punishment they received. Justice demanded accountability. But this is a story about what happens when individual soldiers, exhausted and traumatized and angry, choose mercy anyway. When they see past the uniform to the human being underneath. When they decide that even enemies deserve basic dignity. When they share their last rations with starving men who, in another time and place, might have killed them. The SS officers couldn't believe it because it contradicted everything they had been taught, everything they had experienced, everything they thought they knew about the world. They had been raised in a system that valued strength above all, that glorified conquest and domination, that reduced human beings to categories of useful and useless, superior and inferior. Mercy didn't fit into that system. Compassion was incompatible with that worldview. And yet there it was. Canadian soldiers, young men barely old enough to vote, handing out their own food to the enemy, giving up their blankets, treating wounds, showing basic human decency in the midst of the most brutal war in human history. One German prisoner, in a letter written years after the war, tried to explain what that experience meant to him. He wrote, "I came to Canada as a prisoner expecting to die. I left as a man who had learned that there was something in the world more powerful than hatred. I don't know what to call it. Grace maybe. Or mercy. Or just basic human goodness. Whatever it was, those Canadian soldiers had it and we didn't. That was the real difference between us. Not weapons or tactics or industrial capacity. Character. They had character and we had ideology. And in the end, character won." That letter is now in a museum in Ottawa. Very few people ever see it. It's not part of the main exhibits. It's in the archives, one letter among thousands, one small voice among millions. But it's there, a testament to a moment when humanity overcame hatred. The war created millions of victims. It destroyed cities and nations. It killed 60 million people. It left scars that still haven't healed 80 years later. But in the midst of all that darkness, there were moments of light. Small moments. Moments that might seem insignificant compared to the vast sweep of history. A Canadian soldier sharing a tin of corned beef with a German prisoner. A chocolate bar given to a crying teenager. A blanket offered to a man shivering in the rain. These moments didn't change the outcome of the war. They didn't topple governments or shift battle lines. But they changed the men who experienced them. They proved that even in the darkest times, even in the most brutal circumstances, it's possible to choose compassion over cruelty. It's possible to see the humanity in your enemy. It's possible to be better than the war demands you to be. The SS officers who experienced Canadian mercy carried that experience with them for the rest of their lives. Some of them were able to rebuild their lives, to become productive citizens, to raise families and contribute to society. Others were broken beyond repair by what they had done and what had been done to them. But all of them remembered the Canadians who shared their last rations with starving enemies. All of them carried that memory like a weight, a reminder of what they could have been if they had made different choices. In the years after the war, a small group of former German POWs who had been held in Canada formed an association. They stayed in touch with each other, sharing memories and experiences. Some of them returned to Canada to visit the camps where they had been held, to see the farms where they had worked, to thank the people who had shown them kindness when they deserved none. A few of them tracked down the Canadian soldiers who had guarded them. There are photographs of these reunions, old men embracing, tears streaming down weathered faces. Both sides remembering a time when they were enemies and one side chose mercy. One such reunion happened in 1985, 40 years after the war ended. A former SS Untersturmführer named Hans Berger traveled from Germany to Alberta to meet William Morrison, the sergeant who had given him chocolate and cigarettes when he was a starving prisoner. They met at Morrison's farmhouse, and for a long time, they just stood there looking at each other, two old men seeing ghosts of their younger selves. Finally, Berger said in halting English, "You saved my life. Not with the chocolate. With the reminder that I was still human." Morrison, never comfortable with sentiment, just nodded and invited him inside for coffee. They spent 3 days together walking Morrison's farm, talking about the war, about their families, about the decades that had passed. Berger asked Morrison why he had shown mercy to the German prisoners. Morrison thought for a long time before answering. He said, "I don't know if it was mercy. I just couldn't let them starve. My mother raised me better than that. She always said, 'Billy, you treat people the way you want to be treated, even people who don't deserve it. Especially people who don't deserve it. Because that's when it counts.'" That simple philosophy, taught by a farm woman in Manitoba to her son, ended up meaning the difference between life and death for dozens of German prisoners. It meant the difference between a world that made sense and a world that didn't, for SS officers who had stopped believing in anything except power and domination. It meant that even in the darkest chapter of human history, there was still light. The story of Canadians sharing their rations with German prisoners isn't unique. Similar acts of mercy happened in all the armies on all the fronts. Individual soldiers making individual choices to be human, to show compassion, to refuse to let war turn them into monsters. But what makes this story remarkable is the recipients. SS officers, men who had been part of one of history's most brutal organizations, were shown mercy by the very people they had been taught to despise and destroy. And that mercy broke them more completely than any military defeat ever could. Because mercy is powerful. More powerful than hatred. More powerful than revenge. It's powerful because it's unexpected. It's powerful because it reveals the best of what we can be, even when everything around us is screaming for the worst. It's powerful because it changes both the person who shows it and the person who receives it. The Canadians who shared their rations probably didn't think they were doing anything extraordinary. They were just doing what they'd been raised to do. Feed the hungry. Help the suffering. Show basic human decency. But to the German prisoners, especially the SS officers who had seen and done terrible things, it was revolutionary. It was proof that the world didn't have to be a place of endless hatred and revenge. It was proof that there was another way to be human. In the decades after the war, historians and psychologists studied the behavior of POWs and their captors. They tried to understand what made some prison camps brutal and others relatively humane. They tried to understand why some guards became monsters and others remained compassionate. The research revealed complex patterns involving command structure, cultural values, individual psychology, and situational pressures. But at the core of every finding was a simple truth: How you treat your enemies says more about you than it says about them. The Canadians who treated German prisoners with dignity and shared their last rations weren't naive. They weren't ignorant of what the SS had done. They weren't somehow soft or weak. They were battle-hardened soldiers who had seen some of the worst fighting of the war. They had lost friends. They had been traumatized by what they had witnessed in the concentration camps. They had every reason to hate. But they chose something else. They chose to remain human in an inhuman situation. They chose to feed the hungry even when the hungry were their enemies. They chose mercy when revenge would have been easier and more satisfying. And the SS officers couldn't believe it because in their worldview, such a choice was impossible. It was weak. It was foolish. It made no strategic sense. But they also couldn't deny that it happened. They couldn't deny that they had been shown mercy when they expected death. And for many of them, that experience planted a seed of doubt. Doubt about everything they had believed, everything they had fought for, everything they had done. Some of those men spent the rest of their lives trying to understand what had happened to them in those POW camps. Some of them found redemption in that understanding. Some of them never could reconcile it with their past actions and spent their remaining years in quiet despair. But all of them were changed by it. A Canadian chaplain who worked in the POW camps after the war wrote in his memoirs about conversations he had with German prisoners, particularly SS officers. He wrote, "They would ask me over and over why we fed them, why we gave them medical care, why we treated them like human beings. I would tell them it was because we were Christians, because we believed in mercy and forgiveness. But I don't think they ever fully understood. Their experience of Christianity had been twisted into something that justified hatred and genocide. Our experience of it taught us to feed our enemies. We were reading from the same book but seeing completely different messages. That observation cuts to the heart of the matter. The Canadians and the Germans came from similar cultural backgrounds. They were both products of Western civilization. They both had Christian traditions in their heritage. But they had taken radically different paths. One path led to concentration camps and genocide. The other path led to soldiers sharing their last rations with starving enemies. The difference wasn't resources or education or intelligence. The difference was choice. Every day, every moment, we choose what kind of people we're going to be. We choose whether to see others as human beings worthy of dignity or as objects to be used and discarded. We choose whether to respond to hatred with more hatred or with something better. The Canadian soldiers in 1945 made their choice. They chose compassion. And that choice echoed through decades, changing lives, challenging beliefs, proving that even in the darkest times humanity can survive. The SS officers who experienced that compassion carried the weight of that experience for the rest of their lives. For some, it was a burden. A reminder of opportunities missed, of choices not made, of the men they could have been but weren't. For others, it was a lifeline. Proof that redemption was possible, that they weren't beyond hope, that there was still something good in the world worth living for. In the final analysis, this story isn't really about Canadians and Germans. It's not about the SS or POWs or the Second World War. It's about us. It's about the choices we make when faced with people we have every reason to hate. It's about whether we choose to be defined by our hatred or by our humanity. It's about whether we can see past the uniform, past the ideology, past the actions, to the human being underneath. The Canadians who shared their last rations with starving German prisoners in April 1945 didn't do it for recognition. They didn't do it for medals or glory or historical footnotes. They did it because it was the right thing to do. Because letting people starve, even your enemies, even people who had done terrible things, was wrong. Because at the end of the day we're all human beings and that has to mean something. The SS officers couldn't believe it because they had forgotten what it meant to be human. They had traded their humanity for ideology, for power, for the promise of a 1,000-year Reich that lasted only 12 years and left behind nothing but ashes and mass graves. But when Canadian soldiers handed them food, they were forced to remember. They were forced to confront the fact that the people they had been taught to hate and despise were capable of greater moral courage than they had ever shown. That confrontation, that moment of recognition, was more devastating than any bomb or bullet. Because you can rebuild cities. You can heal physical wounds. But a shattered worldview, a demolished belief system, an ideology proven morally bankrupt not through argument but through action, that's something that can never be fully repaired. The men who experienced it were never the same. They carried those tins of corned beef, those pieces of bread, those acts of inexplicable mercy for the rest of their lives. Some of them passed the story on to their children and grandchildren, trying to explain what it meant, trying to convey the power of that moment when everything they believed was proven wrong by a simple act of human kindness. And that's the legacy. Not the battles or the strategies or the body counts. The legacy is a Canadian soldier, whose name we might never know, taking food from his own mouth to feed a starving enemy. The legacy is the recognition that even in war, even in the most brutal circumstances imaginable, we can choose to be better than our worst instincts demand. We can choose compassion over cruelty. We can choose mercy over revenge. We can choose to remain human. The SS officers couldn't believe Canadians shared their last rations with starving German prisoners because it made no sense in their world. But that's exactly the point. Mercy never makes sense to those who have forgotten what it means to be human. Love never makes sense to those consumed by hate. Compassion never makes sense to those who see the world only in terms of power and domination. But to those who understand that we're all connected, that we all share a common humanity regardless of what uniform we wear or what flag we serve, it makes perfect sense. It's the only thing that makes sense. Because in the end, when the war is over and the battles are done and all that's left is memory, what matters isn't who won or who lost. What matters is whether we remained human. Whether we kept our souls intact. Whether we chose mercy when we could have chosen revenge. The Canadians made that choice. They shared their last rations with starving German prisoners. And in doing so, they proved that even in the darkest chapter of human history, there was still light. Still hope. Still humanity. That's a legacy worth remembering. That's a story worth telling. That's a choice worth making every day in our own lives, when we're faced with people we have every reason to hate but choose instead to see as human beings worthy of dignity and compassion. The SS officers couldn't believe it. But it happened. And the world is better because it did.